Let me begin with a simple question that cuts through the noise of headlines and applause lines. Who is actually winning in today's global economy? When a former US president stands on the stage at Davos and hurls fire across the Atlantic, calling Europe unrecognizable, a mess, while boasting that the United States is booming, we should pause, not to cheer, not to jeer, but to analyze, because behind the theater lies an economic story far more revealing than the insults themselves. Rhetoric versus reality is one of the oldest tensions in political economy, and moments like Davos expose it in its most theatrical form. When powerful figures take the stage to declare victory, strength, and economic dominance, they are rarely describing conditions as they exist for the majority of people. They are shaping a narrative, selecting indicators that flatter their agenda, and repeating them until confidence replaces scrutiny. This is not accidental. It is how economic power protects itself. By controlling the language of success, elites redefine what progress means and who is allowed to claim it. At gatherings like Davos, rhetoric becomes a substitute for evidence. Words such as booming, resilient, or winning are deployed as if they were neutral facts, when in reality they are political choices. A stock market index rising is presented as proof of national health, even though most people own little or no stock. Corporate earnings are celebrated as collective achievement, despite the fact that those earnings often come from cost cutting, layoffs, wage suppression, and outsourcing. The reality is that an economy can produce record profits while simultaneously producing record anxiety among its workforce. This gap between rhetoric and reality is sustained by selective measurement. Gross domestic product grows, productivity increases, and markets respond positively, yet household stability declines. Workers are told the economy is strong while they juggle multiple jobs, postpone medical care, and sink deeper into debt. The language of success silences these contradictions by implying that hardship is temporary or personal rather than systemic. When leaders boast, they are not lying outright, they are telling a partial truth that functions as a full deception. Rhetoric also serves to deflect responsibility. If an economy is declared healthy, then those who struggle within it must be the problem. This framing shifts attention away from structural inequality and toward individual failure. It discourages collective solutions and weakens solidarity because people begin to see their insecurity as isolated rather than shared. In this way, optimistic language becomes a tool of discipline, teaching people to doubt their own experiences in favor of official narratives. The spectacle of confrontation, such as attacking other nations or regions, further obscures reality. By framing economic outcomes as national competitions, leaders divert attention from internal class divisions. Workers are encouraged to identify with national success rather than question who benefits from it. The applause that follows bold declarations is not a response to truth, but to confidence, certainty, and dominance. Rhetoric rewards those who speak with authority, not those who speak with accuracy. What makes this dynamic especially dangerous is its repetition. When rhetoric is echoed by media, reinforced by institutions, and validated by elite gatherings, it begins to feel inevitable. Over time, the language of prosperity replaces meaningful discussion about distribution, power, and control. The economy becomes something to admire from a distance rather than examine closely, and public debate shrinks to competing slogans instead of competing analyses. Booming for whom is the most important question buried beneath celebratory economic headlines because it exposes the difference between abstract growth and lived experience. When political leaders and financial institutions announce that an economy is booming, they are rarely referring to the daily conditions of the majority. They are pointing to indicators that reflect the success of capital rather than the well being of people. This distinction matters because an economy does not exist for charts, markets, or corporations. It exists to organize how human beings produce, distribute, and survive. Economic growth today is increasingly detached from wages. Productivity rises, technology advances, and output expands, yet paychecks remain stagnant when adjusted for inflation. This is not a mystery, nor is it a temporary imbalance. It is the result of deliberate policy choices that weaken labor bargaining power while strengthening corporate leverage. When growth flows upward rather than outward, prosperity becomes concentrated, and the word booming loses its moral and social meaning. Corporate profits are often presented as evidence that everyone is doing well. In reality, profits frequently grow by reducing labor costs, automating jobs without social planning, outsourcing work to cheaper markets, or converting stable employment into precarious contracts. Each of these strategies improves balance sheets while eroding economic security. Workers may technically be employed, but they live with constant uncertainty, one illness or missed paycheck away from crisis. An economy that produces fear alongside profit cannot reasonably be described as successful for the people who sustain it. Wealth inequality sharpens this contradiction. As asset prices rise, those who already own property, stocks, and financial instruments see their wealth multiply. Those who do not are locked out, watching the cost of housing, education, and healthcare climb faster than their incomes. The same boom that enriches investors makes survival more expensive for everyone else. When leaders celebrate rising markets without acknowledging this divide, they normalize exclusion as progress. Debt becomes the hidden engine that keeps the illusion alive. Households borrow to compensate for stagnant wages. Governments borrow to maintain services without challenging wealth concentration. And students borrow to access opportunities that previous generations received at lower cost. Debt masks inequality temporarily, allowing consumption to continue while insecurity deepens. A booming economy built on debt is not a sign of strength, but of postponed crisis. The question of for whom also reveals whose voices are prioritized. Executives, investors, and financial analysts are treated as authorities on economic health, while workers' experiences are dismissed as anecdotal or emotional. Yet it is workers who feel the economy first and most intensely. Their exhaustion, stress, and precarity are not side effects, they are indicators. When an economy booms for the few by extracting more from the many, the celebration itself becomes an act of erasure. Europe is often portrayed as a cautionary tale, a region supposedly weighed down by inefficiency, excessive regulation, and an outdated commitment to social welfare. This narrative is repeated so frequently that it begins to sound self evident, yet it functions less as analysis and more as ideological warning. Europe is not criticized because it is failing in economic terms alone, but because it represents a different set of priorities that complicate the logic of unrestrained profit maximization. What is labeled weakness is, in many cases, resistance. At the center of this resistance are social protections that limit how far markets can penetrate everyday life. Universal health care systems, stronger labor laws, public pensions, and subsidized education reduce the degree to which survival depends on market success. These institutions impose costs on capital and constraints on corporate flexibility, and that is precisely why they are targeted. From a purely profit driven perspective, any system that shields workers from total dependence on employers appears inefficient. Yet, from a social perspective, these protections function as stabilizers, preventing economic shocks from turning into humanitarian crises. Europe's economic model, despite its flaws and contradictions, challenges the idea that insecurity must be the price of competitiveness. Higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy fund public goods that reduce inequality and increase social cohesion. Critics frame this as stagnation, but the deeper concern is control. When basic needs are guaranteed to some degree, workers have greater bargaining power and markets lose their ability to discipline through fear. That shift in power is what truly unsettles advocates of deregulated capitalism. The claim that Europe is unrecognizable reveals more about the speaker than the continent itself. It implies that legitimacy comes from conforming to a single economic model, one that prioritizes growth over stability and profits over people. Any deviation becomes evidence of decline rather than a conscious political choice. This framing erases Europe's internal debates and struggles, reducing complex societies to caricatures designed to justify a particular vision of economic order. Europe's challenges are real: uneven growth, demographic pressures, political fragmentation, and the rise of far right movements exploiting economic anxiety. But these challenges are not caused by social protections alone. They are intensified by the same global forces affecting the rest of the world, including financialization, technological disruption, and capital mobility. To single out welfare systems as the root problem is to ignore how global capitalism constrains national policy choices. In this sense, Europe functions as a warning not of failure, but of limits. It demonstrates that there are boundaries beyond which societies may choose not to go, even at the cost of slower growth or reduced competitiveness. Those boundaries reflect values about dignity, security, and collective responsibility. The discomfort this causes among global elites is not about Europe's decline, but about the possibility that alternative priorities might still be politically imaginable. The idea that nations are locked in a zero sum economic competition is one of the most effective myths in modern politics. By framing global economics as a contest between countries, America versus Europe, East versus West, attention is diverted away from the real lines of conflict that run through every society. This narrative encourages people to identify with flags rather than with their material conditions, transforming economic hardship into a matter of national pride or humiliation rather than systemic design. Workers across different countries often share more in common with one another than with the elites who claim to represent them. A factory worker in the United States facing job insecurity, automation, and declining benefits is living a reality strikingly similar to that of a warehouse worker in Germany or a delivery driver in France. Yet the language of national competition persuades them that they are rivals, each responsible for undercutting the other. This illusion serves those who benefit from cheap labor, weakened unions, and fragmented resistance. By emphasizing national success, political leaders obscure internal inequality. When an economy is described as winning, the implication is that everyone within it shares the victory. This makes it difficult to question why wealth is concentrated at the top or why essential workers struggle to survive. Any critique can be dismissed as unpatriotic or disloyal, silencing legitimate demands for fairness. Nationalism becomes a shield that protects economic structures from scrutiny. Multinational corporations understand this dynamic well. They operate across borders, shifting production, profits, and taxes wherever conditions are most favorable, while workers remain largely immobile. When workers are encouraged to blame those in other countries for job losses or wage pressure, corporations escape accountability for decisions driven by profit maximization. The myth of national competition thus disguises the power of global capital and presents its outcomes as inevitable consequences of international rivalry. Political debates framed around national strength also simplify complex economic problems. Issues such as declining wages, rising housing costs, and precarious employment are treated as external threats rather than internal policy choices. This framing reduces pressure on governments to regulate markets, protect labor, or redistribute wealth. Instead, energy is directed toward symbolic gestures, trade wars, and rhetorical confrontations that do little to improve everyday life. The focus on national rivalry further weakens solidarity. Collective action depends on recognizing shared interests, yet the constant emphasis on borders encourages division. Workers are less likely to organize together when they are told their struggles result from foreign competition rather than domestic power imbalances. This fragmentation benefits those who hold economic power as it prevents the formation of broad coalitions capable of challenging entrenched systems. By shifting attention from class and power to nationality, the myth of competition reshapes how people understand their place in the world. Economic insecurity becomes a feature of global rivalry rather than a consequence of policy and ownership. This narrative limits imagination, making it harder to envision alternatives that prioritize cooperation, shared prosperity, and democratic control over economic life. The concentration of power and wealth is not a side effect of modern capitalism, it is one of its defining features. Over time, economic systems built around private ownership and profit accumulation tend to funnel resources, influence, and decision making authority toward a small minority. This process is often described as efficiency or innovation, but in practice, it reflects a structural imbalance that shapes every aspect of social and political life. As wealth accumulates at the top, so does the power to shape laws, narratives, and institutions in ways that preserve that accumulation. One of the primary mechanisms driving this concentration is corporate consolidation. Industries that once supported many competitors increasingly come to be dominated by a few large firms. Through mergers, acquisitions, and market capture, these corporations gain the ability to set prices, suppress wages, and influence regulation. Workers face fewer employment options, consumers face higher costs, and governments face powerful actors capable of shaping policy in their favor. Concentration becomes self reinforcing as economic dominance translates into political leverage. Financialization further accelerates this dynamic. Profits are increasingly generated not through producing goods or services, but through financial instruments, speculation, and asset appreciation. Those who already own capital benefit disproportionately, while those who rely on wages are left behind. Financial markets reward short term gains, often at the expense of long term stability, employment, and investment in communities. This shift intensifies inequality while insulating wealth from democratic oversight. Risk is systematically shifted downward. When economic decisions succeed, rewards flow upward to executives and shareholders. When they fail, costs are absorbed by workers, communities, and governments. Layoffs, wage cuts, pension reductions, and public bailouts are treated as necessary adjustments, even as those responsible for the decisions remain protected. This asymmetry reveals how power operates within the system, ensuring that vulnerability is concentrated among those with the least control. Political influence follows economic concentration. Wealthy individuals and corporations fund campaigns, lobby legislators, and shape public discourse through media ownership and sponsorship. Policies that might redistribute power or wealth are portrayed as unrealistic, dangerous, or extreme, while policies that benefit capital are framed as pragmatic and inevitable. Democratic processes remain formally intact, yet their outcomes are increasingly constrained by economic power. As concentration deepens, inequality becomes normalized. Extreme wealth at the top is celebrated as success, while poverty and precarity are explained away as personal failure or unfortunate necessity. This normalization dulls public outrage and narrows the range of acceptable debate. When power is concentrated, alternatives become harder to imagine, not because they are impossible, but because the system rewards silence, compliance, and fragmentation over collective challenge. The most important questions about the economy are often the ones least likely to be asked in public forums dominated by power and privilege. Who owns the productive resources of society? Who controls investment decisions? Who benefits when the economy grows? And who bears the costs when it falters? These questions cut beneath surface debates about growth rates, competitiveness, and market confidence, and they expose the underlying structure of economic life. Their absence from mainstream discussion is not accidental. It reflects how threatening they are to established interests. Economic systems are routinely presented as neutral, technical arrangements governed by experts rather than political choices shaped by values and power. This framing discourages democratic engagement by suggesting that ordinary people lack the knowledge to participate meaningfully. When difficult questions are raised about inequality or ownership, they are often dismissed as ideological or impractical. Yet the existing system is itself ideological, built on assumptions that prioritize profit, private control, and endless growth over social well being. Avoiding fundamental questions allows inequality to persist without justification. If the economy is treated as an objective force rather than a human made system, then its outcomes appear inevitable. Wealth concentration becomes a fact of life rather than a result of policy, and insecurity becomes an unfortunate but necessary condition. This resignation weakens political will and narrows the horizon of possibility, making reforms seem unrealistic even when public dissatisfaction is widespread. Crises expose the cost of this avoidance. Financial collapses, housing shortages, healthcare failures, and environmental disasters repeatedly reveal systemic flaws. Yet responses focus on stabilization rather than transformation. Emergency measures are taken to restore the system to working order, not to reconsider whether the system itself is working for the majority. Once the immediate danger passes, deeper questions are pushed aside, ensuring that similar crises will return in new forms. The refusal to ask fundamental questions also fragments resistance. Without a shared understanding of how power operates, discontent is channeled into cultural conflicts, identity based rivalries, and nationalist resentments. These divisions absorb energy that might otherwise challenge economic structures. People are encouraged to argue over symbols while decisions about investment, production, and distribution remain insulated from democratic control. Ownership is particularly absent from mainstream debate, despite its central role in shaping outcomes. Who owns factories, platforms, land, and data determines how work is organized and how rewards are distributed. When ownership is concentrated, decision making follows the interests of a few, regardless of social cost. Questioning ownership is not radical, it is foundational, yet it is treated as taboo because it threatens the core of existing power arrangements. As long as these questions remain unasked, the future will resemble the past. Inequality will deepen, insecurity will spread, and crises will be managed rather than prevented. An economy that cannot be questioned cannot be reimagined, and a society